Well, you seem so against everything. What are you for? What does your ideal world look like? This was a question that was posed to me some time ago that really caught me off guard. As activists, how often we stop, let our anger at atrocities subside, and really envision this better world that we're fighting for. As an Occupy Wall Street activist, in July 2012, at the National Gathering in Philadelphia, many of us participated in an exercise where we had to do just this, but we could not use the word no. For example, instead of saying no police brutality or no stop and frisk, we would elaborate by saying community involvement in keeping our neighborhoods safe without resorting to violence or harassment. Or instead of saying no income inequality, we would say equal access for everyone to livable housing, clothing, and healthy food. This is a good first step, but beyond that, how many of us have imagined what an entire day would look like in this better world? What our lives would be like from when we woke up until when we went to sleep? Would we still be working as much? Would we be driving vehicles that pollute our earth? What would we be eating? Would we be growing it ourselves or obtaining it locally? Would money still be utilized? What would it be like for those of us identifying as women and or part of the LGBTQ community to walk down the street without potentially confronting harassment? I could go on and on. During the summer of 2013, I had the opportunity to visit Cuba for the first time. I read about its history since the 26th of July, 1953, on to the triumph of the revolution in 1959 and beyond. I tried to keep an open mind of what I would see, think, feel, experience, and I left with even more questions than I came with. I continued to study Che and Fidel and was intrigued by their government and the way it functions. I was born and raised in eastern Central Florida. The only memory I have from childhood about anything related to Cuba was the Elian Gonzalez affair in 1999. Not a single lesson in grade school mentioned the country 90 miles off of our shore. Not until a college class on Latin American studies did I learn about its history, and even then, it was only the history of past centuries of sugar plantations and slavery. Although furious at not having been taught about such a noteworthy revolution that took place so close to my home, I consider myself somewhat lucky. The alternative would likely have been to learn how the U.S. condemns Cuba for human rights violations. The very U.S. that blockades every country from doing business with Cuba, that fines banks multi-millions and billions of dollars for transactions with Cuba, for countries trading sugar and other staples to provide Cuba with much-needed medicines and food. The very U.S. that aids Israel $3 billion per year and condemns flotillas and other vessels filled with humanitarian aid to Gaza and the West Bank for the peoples of Palestine. The very U.S. that spends billions of dollars on the U.S. military, occupying over 1,000 military bases worldwide, yet cuts food stamps from its very own people and refuses to raise the minimum wage. The very U.S. that just sent over 4,000 troops to Africa to help fight Ebola, while Cuba has sent 2 brigades of several hundred medical personnel, and others are likely to be on their way. The U.S. cries for U.S. subcontractor Alan Gross being held in prison in Cuba after being arrested in 2009 and convicted in 2011 for illegally bringing in satellites and computer equipment without the permit required by Cuban law. Yet the U.S. is still holding Ramon, Antonio, and Gerardo, members of the Cuban Five, unjustly in prison since 1998, who exposed terrorist plots against Cuba and were convicted for conspiracy to commit espionage. Once again, I could go on, but I don't think the U.S. has any ability to talk about human rights violations. Fernando Gonzalez, a freed member of the Cuban Five, met with the Venceremos Brigade this year, working alongside of us in the sugarcane field in Canito, Matanzas, and answering questions that we had. A man and an entire country that have no reason to trust a group of Americans, but do anyways. Not only do they trust us, but they welcome us with open arms, feed us, present us with transparency and truth. Some may be wondering and ask me, how do I know it was transparent and in the truth? In all honesty, the first time, I wasn't sure. I came face to face with anger and anxiety from what the country of my birth had done to me, about how it lied to me, told me half-truths, required and forced me to recite a pledge of allegiance that I had no idea what it meant, stifled my creativity and intimidated me from asking questions, and never wanted me or anyone around me to think critically. And this left me untrusting of many people. But I wanted to go again, and this year I wasn't new to Cuba and was able to take in much more. We had the opportunity to witness a presentation from a Cuban economist who told us straight up, if Cuba's economic model doesn't modernize itself, it will fail. He explained that providing people with all essentials, such as housing and food for low prices, and expecting them to still work is actually definitely a problem that they still face. They are working on developing incentives and creating opportunities and options. We also got to meet with the heads of a union at a tobacco factory, and they spoke with us about their conditions. If a person is sick, they must call in, go to the doctor for a note, and present it to HR on the day that they return. If it is presented, they will receive 60% of their pay for the days that they were absent. There are no quotas on how many sick days you can have per year, by the way, also. When a woman is pregnant, she receives 1 year paid maternity leave and a guaranteed position upon return. After a certain length of time, the father can choose to be the one to take the leave if that is the desire of the family. In 1961, the literacy campaign was launched, where thousands of brigadistas were sent all throughout the country to teach people to read and write. Within less than 1 year, in December of 1961, illiteracy had been completely eradicated. The literacy rate today remains at 99%. Women played a huge role in the campaign and still play an extremely significant role in Cuban society today, many of the heads of their respective organizations, and enjoying equal pay with men for the same job. Education is free all the way through PhD for all citizens, and Cuba has educated millions of doctors that are now practicing worldwide. Healthcare is also free, as well as medication costs mere pennies even for foreigners. Thanks to Senesex and its director, Mariela Castro, who has been a guest here at the IAC, children as young as 3rd grade are being taught about their sexuality and learning to be respectful and inclusive of people in the LGBTQ community. Farmers and teachers are the highest paid professions in the country, although those in tourism are also catching up. We learned that the sweet potatoes we were harvesting would go from the urban garden to the market in approximately 4 hours. Incredible when you consider that it can be days or weeks before produce reaches shelves here in the U.S. and is generally discarded after its expiration date. In Cuba, it becomes compost. One of the most prominent differences when first arriving to Cuba is the lack of advertisements. All billboards are for historical purposes, and Cuban history is very accessible, unlike the history of many people living here in the United States. Another difference in Cuba is its art. Artists are encouraged in their field, unlike in the United States, where creativity is sometimes killed at an early age and the arts are discouraged because it won't get you a well-paying job. We were able to visit a beautiful artistic community not far from the side of the Bay of Pigs. Here, residents stay for 11 months out of the year to cultivate their crafts in dance, painting, music, poetry, and theater. This is their profession, and they are paid to continue their art here, and many go on to have careers in the field. Years back, the young communists leaving Cuba surveyed all the empty walls in Havana and distributed them to artists to display their work. The only requirements for these artists was that they were to present a positive message, and it had to be for the people. Approximately 80% of Cubans own their own homes, and those that don't only pay 10% salary per month of the head of the household until it is owned. Selling homes used to be illegal, but only swaps were allowed, but this is no longer the case. There are no homeless people in Cuba, although there is still a housing dilemma for many, with generations living together in one house. Because racism has been nearly abolished according to most Cubans, statistics such as arrests, owning homes, pay, etc. cannot be determined based on race. All people are considered Cubans, but it makes it somewhat difficult to determine if there is still any remaining oppression. Election campaigns can only be run by presenting publicly a black and white photo and a brief biography. No money can be taken, and the playing field is is even. In conclusion, I want to emphasize that it is not the government that is affected by the U.S. blockade against Cuba, it is the Cuban people. It is the people that have less access to food and medicine, to transportation and housing. By continuing this more than half-a-century blockade that was once again voted against by almost all countries in the UN, with 3 abstaining and only 2 in favor, being the United States and Israel. The U.S. continues to negatively impact the very people it claims to want to save. But in spite of the blockade, socialism in Cuba is alive. The people continue to fight for their self-determination, and they continue to win. And they're gaining more and more global support. So what does my ideal world look like? My ideal world looks a lot like Cuba. But that's not the end. We have to keep fighting for more than that. We have to help heal one another, encourage one another, and love one another. Viva la revolución cubana, hasta la victoria siempre y venceremos.